want to turn the microphone over to Ann Serac, the Director of Exhibitions for Exhibit Columbus, and Kelly Wilson, the J. Irwin and Xenia S. Miller Prize Coordinator. Ann and Kelly.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Thanks again to everybody, especially our jury, for being with us today. And really importantly for me and our entire curatorial team, thank you to our Miller Prize finalists for being part of Exhibit Columbus. It's really been our great pleasure to get to know you all over this last year. First, through talks about your work, as Exhibit Columbus sought to identify nationally recognized leading and emerging studio-based practices in architecture, art, and design who would rise to the challenges of this exhibition. And then in person this fall. The Miller Prize finalists have traveled from California, Massachusetts, New York, Oklahoma, and Wisconsin to learn about Columbus and its community. In September, they participated in Exhibit Columbus's inaugural symposium, Foundations and Futures, where we laid the groundwork for thinking about Columbus's cultural heritage through the eyes of those that have helped shape it, discussed how it is being cared for today, and looked at what is next from fabricators, educators, and our own vision, Exhibit Columbus, an exhibition designed to ignite a new conversation centered around the value of good design. The Miller Prize finalists spent several days touring the city, participating in discussions about their own practices, and absorbing this notion of the Columbus way, which really must be experienced in person. And now here we are, waiting to hear from the group of 10 brilliant teams who will each present ideas today that will build upon the potential of Columbus and its unique design heritage, and reintroduce Columbus to a national conversation about innovative design. So I thank you all again for being here today, being a part of Exhibit Columbus, and being incredible people to work with.
Thank you. Good morning. The J. Irwin and Xenia S. Miller Prize honors the legacy of two of the 20th century's greatest patrons of architecture, art, and design, and a family whose visionary commitment to community remains unparalleled. These 10 finalists, our Miller Prize finalists, have been selected to compete for Miller Prizes at 5 iconic locations along 5th Street. The Miller Prize installations will be a temporary transformation of their sites. These installations are intended to provide a new awareness and interpretation of the site via a dialogue or a conversation or response with the formal and intellectual ideas found within the context of the assigned sites and the community. Over the course of today, Ann and I will introduce each of the 5 sites and the finalists presenting design concepts related to each site. Upon conclusion of these presentations, our jury will deliberate and select a winner for each site to realize their design concepts. These will be the centerpieces of the 2017 exhibition, which opens August 26th of next year. We will announce the jury's decision later this month, not today. This weekend truly is our celebration of new ideas from each of our 10 Miller Prize finalists. Now, how things will go. Each of the prize finalists will present their design proposal. They have been given 20 minutes, and I'll be marking time. And this 20 minutes is for them to explain their concept to the jury. An additional 10 minutes will be given to allow questions from the jury to the presenters. So let's start with the first site, which is First Christian Church, 1942, by Eliel Saarinen. And we start our presentation with the oldest of the sites of the 5 in First Christian. One that has visually defined our community for almost 75 years and is one of the first modern churches built in the United States. I'd like to welcome our Miller Prize finalists to come up. Studio Indigenous is an architectural design firm in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, led by Chris Cornelius, as a design practice focused on creating intelligent, thoughtful, and contemporary design solutions for American Indian clients. As a member of the United Nation of Wisconsin, Chris is concerned with the architectural translation of Native culture in order to make that culture experiential. Chris has been the recipient of numerous awards and honors, including an Artist in Residency Fellowship from the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian, and multiple wins in the Ken Roberts Architectural Delineation Competition. He recently served as a cultural consultant and design collaborator with Antoine Predock on the Indian Community School of Milwaukee. Please welcome Chris Cornelius.
Sagoli. Gwakuf Nawela Du, Chris Dion Getz, Akwahoni Wagita Loda, Akale, Oniata Aga, Niwaga de Honchoda. Hello, I extend my greetings, love, and thankfulness to all of you. My name is Chris Cornelius. I am of the Wolf Clan, and people of the Standing Stone is the earth that I come from. I believe in the reconciliatory power of architecture, that architecture is a way for us to reconcile ourselves to nature. And so in architecture school, we learn about Loger and Vitruvius and how architecture stems from finding things in the wild and taking those things and building from that. Politics are created, language is created from that. And so in this image by Loger, we can see the woman pointing towards this thing as if it is her architecture. This is my architecture from my trees made from my wood. Indigenous architecture is a little different. I believe that we see nature, it is true, I wholeheartedly believe that we see nature as one of our relatives, that the architecture stems from that, from our relationship with nature, that we are in reciprocity with nature, and the ways that we try to find ourselves in the land is through creating a covenant with the land and through the stewardship of it. So the differences between these two approaches, I think, is one, nature is mine versus nature is me. So in researching who's indigenous to Columbus or the Columbus area, it was very difficult to find this information. I think the information has been kind of lost and forgotten. But for the most part, this region was largely Miami or Mia. But the other tribes, Potawatomi, Shawnee, Delaware, all kind of crossed this landscape, and it was a kind of meeting place. The image on the right is the state and all of the treaties that ceded lands to settlers. Ceded is the word that is used in lieu of stolen. So, but basically what it did was it opened up for people to purchase land. And so Bartholomew County lies within that Treaty of St. Mary's from 1818. The Miami and most of the tribes in this area, I'm actually from indigenous to New York, so I'm part of the Iroquois Confederacy, but my reservation is in Wisconsin. We're all kind of eastern woodlands, Great Lakes tribes, and our dwellings are some form of this. This one is a wigwam. This would be the sort of an indigenous dwelling of the Miami. These are created from bent wood poles that are clad with either bark or cattail reed mats. This one you can see birch bark that is stripped from the trees and sewn together and it is cladding this structure. This is one that's under construction, so saplings are used, they're placed into the ground. They have these long, vertical, thin elements that are then bent over as one sort of continuous structural member. They came in different shapes, domes, even conical. They're used for different purposes, but primarily the dwelling. They're also used for sweat lodges and ceremonies. And as I said, they're clad in usually two different things, either a reed mat from cattails or bark, birch bark, elm bark, and they're taken off in trees. I do think that these things, when I began to really look at them, are feats of architectural wonder, because they not only talk about the sympathetic nature of being with the land, but they're actually quite sophisticated in that the poles are set into the earth about 2 to 3 feet, and they are sort of canted so that they can hold that tension of spanning that long member. They're creating a dwelling that has to have a fire in it. That doesn't create smoke in the whole thing, so it's ventilated. Some of them have really sophisticated sort of ventilation systems where they would dig a hole in the ground, and the hole would go underneath and outside, so that outside air was drawing through the fire, and they would make sort of a ductwork really out of birch bark to make that happen. So these are the sort of dwellings that would be in this area if it were before European contact. In Eliel Saarinen's book, Search for Form, rather, he talks a bit about how he looks at nature and finds form in nature. And so one of the plates in the book is this painting by Bruno Lafors, which is the eagle catching a rabbit. And I think that Saarinen doesn't really go into analyzing this painting. I do, however, think that it is an interesting way of illustrating what he's saying in the book. I also, when I started to really kind of look at this painting, I began to realize perhaps, I don't know this for sure, but perhaps his son, Arrow, was actually looking at it when he was thinking about how do I make a flight center, right? How do I generate the form for a flight center at TWA terminal? Some people think it's about an airplane, but I think it might be more about an actual bird or eagle. So birds of prey, raptors, specifically eagles, are one of the things that are very important to Native people. It doesn't matter where we are from, the indigenous people of North America. The eagle is our watcher, keeper, warns us of things, and so that is why the feathers of eagles are very important to us. And in fact, Native Americans are the only ones that can possess eagle feathers. It's a federal offense for someone who's not native to possess one or even touch one, to be honest. But the feathers to me are interesting because they are not only purposeful, but they're part of its cladding, part of its coloration, and part of its technology, right, for flight. The Miami people, their traditional art is this sort of ribbon, putting together these ribbons, and generally they have this sort of triangular lei motif. So in Native culture, we don't have a way of explaining things like this equals this equals that. But I have to believe that they are so sympathetic to nature that these things start to come out. So you could associate the ways and configuration of the feather pattern on an eagle or scales on a fish or something else that is in nature that would create these arts. So my proposal is a wikiyami, which is the Miami word for wigwam. And so it situates itself on the corner here on the church, and it is a frame that is clad in basically copper shingles. So in plan, when I'm starting to look at the Saarinen Church, thinking about what not only the history of the church and where it came from, but I began to realize that Eliel Saarinen really used the golden section for everything in the church, basically. So I began to geometrically sort of analyze this. So you can see that the church takes up a city block. If you come out to the corner, this is all one golden rectangle. It determines where the edge of the courtyard is, where the tower is. And so there are a number of things that kind of line up here. The number of things that line up tell me that this is exactly what he did. There's more than coincidence there. So in this analysis, I also realized that one of these lines tells you why the cross is off center, right? So this lines up, and the sanctuary lines up with that line that's off center. So I'm trying to lock my proposal into that geometry. The golden section is something that I use in my work quite a bit. I think that it's just a thing that kind of works for me. So the plan of this proposal sits within that sort of geometry. The form of it in plan is not just a simple conical shape, but it sort of leans forward towards the Saarinen and it looks at the tower, right? So it's kind of twisting a little bit towards the tower. I found this sketch in a book by Nabokov and Easton about Native American architecture. A number of my images come from that. By Ezra Stiles, and he was the president of Yale College at the time. So this is his drawing of a wigwam, and I think the drawing is really beautiful in the sense that what he did with the drawing is he drew the dome without letting his pen come from the paper, right? So he's not just drawing it as a simple circle, but he's showing you the form of the thing. The fall equinox is a solar event that would happen during the time that this would be installed in September. So I am trying to acknowledge that as well. And so the lines here is when that would actually happen. I came back in November to the site and took a number of photographs. I actually went out on Sunday morning. I watched people go into church. I didn't tell anyone I was coming back to Columbus. But I did realize that this walkway along here is very important. Not only to the people that go to church, but the people in Columbus. A lot of people just walk down this walkway instead of taking the sidewalk over here. But another thing I realized is just how extraordinary the site is in fall, and that my installation, if it were built, would be there during this time. I also began to realize that, Saarinen had a similar sort of sympathy with nature in the coloration of the building, the color of the mullions, all reflect that warmness of nature, right? The landscape that is there. So it was really a beautiful sort of morning, and was a great experience. And I was happy to kind of come back and when I wasn't here for an event, but to actually observe how people use the site. So this proposal acknowledges that equinox. So if you get a chance to see the model, there is a notch in the front that would allow light to come through that equinox, creating a solar event. You can kind of see this is the one time that the sun can come through and reach the ground. So the pavilion itself kind of reaches back to the landscape, goes over the sidewalk again, so it's open so that people can walk through it and use it in however they like. I am proposing to keep the construction rather simple, to use a kind of humble material, just like these materials were used, not only for their technological appropriateness, but what was available. So I'm proposing to make the frame out of concrete reinforcing bar of different sizes that would be painted a dark color. And so, my experience as an architect, I find that when you go to a construction site, the people that make the rebar for structures, it's really sculpture that gets buried in concrete, right? I mean, these are really like artisans that make these things and tie them together. And so I kind of want to bring that into the project so that you'd be able to see that within the piece. So this is an interior shot. And again, you can walk through. This is the trees that are shading that sort of walkway. And then the copper panels that would clad the exterior of the pavilion are perforated. And so I worked with Zahner Metals. I actually have a former student that works at Zahner. So this is one of their finishes, the dirty penny finish and the perforation. So I would work with them to kind of figure out the exact finish of it and to create the panels on the exterior of it. So during the project, I've been in discussion with the Miami Center at Miami University. These are people that I've worked with before in the past. And so what I'm proposing to do is to hold an event sometime September, October as part of this installation as an event beyond the actual exhibit Columbus. That would be a time for the Miami students to come and tell stories within this pavilion so that they'd be able to come inside and share with Columbus and the church some of the Miami culture and the importance of storytelling within their culture. This is the view from the playground, and so the pavilion itself kind of leans towards this, and so when you look up, this is kind of what you see. And in conclusion, I want to thank Scott Shoemaker of the Idle Georg Museum and George Einstrack of the Miami Center at Miami University. They were very instrumental and very helpful in the research of the project. Yabako, thank you.
Interior experience and also the materials, like the colored pieces at the top.
Sure. Oh, the colored pieces at the top. So here's the thing. It's part of its regalia, right? These pieces, these elements are part of its regalia. And so while I'm making this thing, as an architect, I want to talk about, well, this is what it's made out of, this is how it's painted, and I don't want to talk about that right now. I just want to talk about the fact that that's there. It's part of its headdress, right? It's part of its regalia. But the pieces themselves, I think, could be made rather simply and lightweight. They're not any kind of instrumentation or anything like that, but they are part of its headdress, right? You can see that within that structure. You should be able to see up through that. You can see kind of here the opening. You can see those elements.
So, is there a principal entrance, or is the pieces that meet the ground, is that all open? So can you access it from all sides?
So I should invite you to just come up and take a look at the model, because in designing this thing, I realized that when I started to think about where an entrance might be, I thought it was probably better to have something that people walked through instead of by. So there is an opening, there are openings on both sides that would straddle that walkway. It's close to 60 feet, I mean, up here. You know, I'm really want to extend the ability of the rebar itself, and so, I mean, I would have to get some sort of engineering to figure out, but I mean, the goal is to really get it as high as I could get it. Yes. I mean, that's the thing I'm trying to achieve, and so that's why I had to work with Zahner and getting the right amount of perforation, and the right amount of perforation and getting light in there. I mean, from the model, you can kind of see into it. But the notion is to try to get as much light through that thing as possible through the perforation and how the panels kind of overlaid with one another.
Do you imagine the panels being welded to the rebar? Are they tied?
I think they're tied, to be honest. I think that they would be tied from the corner. So the panels aren't exactly this shape. They're a little bit different. So the top edge is a little shorter. But I believe that they could be tied and basically kind of rest on one another in a shingle kind of way. So it wasn't part of what we were asked to do, to think about what happens to the thing at the end. Does it get taken down? Does it move or whatever? But I wanted to create a kind of construction that could at least be disassembled easily, and then perhaps recreated or reconstructed somewhere else.
Would you mind going to your site plan and just, now that we know the project, speak a little bit about where the openings are located and the sort of choreography you imagine visually and for pedestrians and...
So it straddles the walkway, and so people can walk through it. When I came back in November with no leaves on the trees, the site plan looks rather dense with the tree canopy. But in reality, the canopy of these three trees kind of reaches back a bit. There is a kind of opening within this that I'm trying to site myself within in order to do that, to kind of grow through that. So it would block off this walkway here, but maintain this one sort of laterally. That seemed to be the one that got the most use from my observation.
You mentioned, I think, that people were coming from one direction and they tended to use one side of the walkway. How did you consider the site more from a distance?
You know, I didn't put it in this shot, but this view of approaching the thing down the street, so if you're coming down 5th Street, you'd be able to kind of see the tail of this thing and the way that it eases itself into the landscape. Also, the approach from this side, from the library, to allow that to kind of be revealed through the landscape. So I'm thinking about those things, and I'm trying to put something within that tree canopy that seems like it had always been there, right? That's kind of the way that I'm thinking about it.
The formal construction is based on a wigwam, more or less. Its construction, its origins, its formal qualities. Do you imagine this as a gateway to First Christian Church? Do you imagine it as a different kind of threshold entering into the space of the church?
Mhm.
What do you imagine it to be?
I certainly see it as a threshold, a thick threshold that has space that you can inhabit if you like. So it's not just like, the Campanile here or some sort of propylaea sort of gateway sort of thing, but it is all of those things, right? It's not just like a dwelling, but it is this sort of threshold that people can kind of gravitate towards, through, and around naturally.
Feels to me like spirituality is something that both projects would share, spirituality understood through light. Is that an intended aspect of?
Certainly. I mean, in Native culture, spirituality is not a separate thing from culture, right? It's part of who we are. And so I ultimately kind of architecturally want to make something that feels spiritual, but doesn't prescribe how you might proceed with a ritual or something like that. So one of the things that was communicated to me from the church was this sort of idea of a very simple outside, but a very complex inside, and that reflects the life of the people in Columbus and the church. And so that's part of what I'm trying to do, is to make a really sort of interesting inside as well as the outside.
Just to clarify, the orientation of the piece is toward the Campanile, toward the bell tower?
Yeah.
Yeah. And it looks to me like the footprint of the piece fits onto that side very snugly.
Mm-hmm.
What came first, the orientation first, or sort of the footprint, and then you kind of, then the form kind of come out from that?
The footprint. I will say this, my trip in early November, I really locked into what I was going to do on that day. So what I did was I actually drew the footprint with my feet in the leaves, and I took a picture of it because I felt like this is the area that it should sit within. That seemed appropriate. The orientation was also something I wanted to do. It coincidentally lines up with that sort of equinox lineup, but it also lines up with one of these golden mean sort of diagonals. So there was a kind of confluence of things that led me to believe that that's probably the right spot for it. Thank you.